Hello there, welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is of course the show where we dive into weird and unusual albums of, all sorts of course, right? So today we're definitely returning to the world of Swans, with a look at one of their most popular and beloved albums within their whole discography, it seems. And so this one, I would say this is actually a very unusual album. It's one that, showcases a new direction for the band, which is very exciting, of course. And yet it is, very dark and disturbing album at times, I didn't realise just how deep it goes until I started researching it for this episode, but yeah, this is, goodness, this one's very uncomfortable at times. So yeah, of course, this is a dive into the 1987 album, Children of God. Yeah, so I'll be honest, been nervous, but also quite excited to talk about this one. So as we do for the Swans videos, let's ask who were Swans when Children of God was recorded. So the lineup for Swans consisted of Michael Youre on vocals, of course, keyboards, acoustic guitar, production, and even the design and concept for the cover art, apparently. And then of course we have Jabo on vocals, backing vocals, piano and keyboards here, as well as the one and only Norman Westberg on electric guitar and acoustic guitar this time. And so we also have one Aldous Kiz returning for bass guitar here, and one Theodore Parsons on drums and percussion. But alongside the band, there's actually a number of guest musicians that appear on one or two of the tracks here. They offer flutes, cellos, oboes, and additional pianos. They're all making little appearances on the songs, which further expands upon the sonic palette that, the album offers up, essentially. And it all results in a Swans album, that it's very different to what we've heard thus far in this little mini-series we're doing here, but it's one that really expands the band's creativity in such amazing ways, of course. So let's just dive into each and every one of its songs then, shall we? So, Children of God, it of course opens up with the phenomenal New Mind, a track that perfectly introduces us to this newer, more refined style of Swans that, still features that incredibly heavy pummeling style. And yet there's this polished edge to it now, though. But also, guess what? This is a rarity within the entirety of the Swans catalogue, as New Mind comes with a music video. Amazing stuff, really. We've never actually gotten to mention one because there just hasn't been one. In any case, though, this is a great opening track. Though you've got these drums pushing along with these really loud rhythmic thuds as the guitar, of course, screeches in the background, playing around on its oddly delightful little riff, I would say. But what I find interesting is the incorporation of, much more vocals for the chorus of I Will Be There, of course. And it kind of acts as this sort of call and response thing from Youre to the rest of the band. And it's easy to see why this song is kind of revered amongst, fans of the band, and it contains all the elements that just make up a great Swan song, I feel. You've got loud, fuzzy, almost discordance going on, but it feels like a really structured song at the same time, unlike the dirgy atonal explorations from the previous albums we've looked at. Lyrically, this is an interesting one as well. In terms of a sort of quasi-religious imagery, which is a theme we've definitely seen it from Youre, of course, on previous songs and previous albums. But this is one that really dominates a lot of this album, of course. You just look at the name Children of God, right? And to me, it kind of then feels almost like a religious pastor or some evangelist, preaching to their audience, condemning them and insisting, that their way is the right way, of course, And it results in this very intimidating album opener that is, without a doubt, one of the best ways to open up a Swans album. Arguably, anyway. In any case, though, we move on to the second track, In My Garden, which is a radical departure from those monolithic dirges that we're used to from the band. And this is, I would say it's quite a fascinating track to have as your second track one, as it strays so far and wide from what we're used to from the band, and yet it perfectly ties into this album experience so well. Being this very gentle, somber, and incredibly moody little piano ballad, with lead vocals from Jarbo, of course. And I love in the background, though, there's this incredibly ominous little guitar line pushing the composition along, alongside it, essentially, and alongside that, you're getting these little instrumental sound effects that, and even field recordings of birds and stuff that help paint this really beautiful picture being presented by Jarbo. And lyrically, this one apparently is interpreted to be as a reference to the Garden of Eden, of course, which once again ties into that religious imagery that the whole album is presenting here. And I have to say, it's a very interesting track, though, not just on the album, but within the whole Swans repertoire. It's very musically different from what we've heard from the band, but I like its inclusion on the album, as it kind of broadens the creative output of the band significantly, showcasing this kind of softer side musically in terms of the sonic palette, but it still has so many of those moods and emotions that we know from the band. Of course, moving on, track 3, of course, Our Love Lies, which is perhaps a track from Swans that, I don't think we get, this one gets discussed all that much, to be fair. And I find this one, kind of, remarkably interesting, as it continues that concept of exploring new musical directions by having the dominating factor being the acoustic guitar this time. And I really, really love the incredibly low register in which Youre just croons the vocals, though, as it sounds so satisfying to listen to as he presents to us this track that, of course, continues the religious imagery, right? Presenting us this character that's, perhaps looking towards God in their time of death, perhaps, maybe, I don't know. Or perhaps there's this, inner turmoil from the radical difference between what God says and what God does, right? But in any case, it's one of those interesting ones where you kind of have to make inferences for yourself, I would argue, like so many things anyway. But it's a lovely slow little number that's kind of an underrated track on this album, and what I find interesting is it kind of showcases to me a lot of the kind of stuff we can see not just from Swans, but from Youre himself, though, such as that mid-90s period of the gothic rock stuff, or even the Angels of Light era, or even the solo performances that Youre did when he was touring with Christoph Hahn, I would say. Songs written for the acoustic guitar, essentially. It makes sense to me, at least, right? And so, we move on to track 4, Sex, God, Sex, which is weird name, weird band, but we'll come back to it much later on in the video, I'd say. Anyway, this one brings us back to the heavy fuzz that we're much more accustomed to. It's that super slow monolithic tempo as Westberg does that thing where his fuzzy notes travel up and down the neck of the guitar, whilst Youre, of course, is just crooning over the top of it. And what I find interesting is how structurally and musically a song like Sex, God, Sex is very similar to that early no-wave era Swans, but it's sounding so much more refined in terms of like the mix on Children of God here, Everything's, much more clear and delightful, with it being heavy, but it's not distorted beyond comprehension, I would argue. And, anyway, as you might imagine, of course, this one is, of course, full of religious imagery. Like, we're going to be saying that a lot in this review, essentially. And, it kind of comes across as an expression of love and admiration to God, sort of debasing oneself and just begging of the Lord to come and take them, And there's something, very odd and, very overtly sexual about it, of course, especially given the name, right? And, I, at first, was asking myself, is this perhaps, one of Youre's weird lyrical tirades, interpreting the worship of God in a sexual way? But I think I have a much more clearer idea of what I think this song might be about, and we'll come back to that later in the video, I would say. It's very weird, though, regardless. Very weird. But what I like in this track, though, is the refrain. You get the instrumentals build up so nicely and slowly as Youre just howls out this refrain a cappella before the band all just comes back in humming and oohing and ahhing with their own backing vocals. making the track feel so much more intimidating as a result, And to me, it results in such a quintessential Swans track, heavy, dirgy, and kind of filthy in its own way, right? So track 5, Blood and Honey. This one interests me a lot though, especially in terms of its musical structure, as you've got this very ominous, spooky guitar line playing this little loop, accompanied by these very dark little notes on the piano that create a really unsettling atmosphere. And this opener just unfolds for, seemingly ages before Jarbo just takes the lead with the vocals again, using her voice to great effect as she presents, this really creepy imagery of dead bodies floating in the river. And I like how the more the song progresses, the more atmospheric those instrumentals become, before turning into these swirling spectres that flow in and out of the track. And also should be mentioned, the spoken word from Jarbo, the spoken word passage from Jarbo is particularly fascinating, especially with her own voice vocalising in the background of it all. It just continues this swirling miasma of ghosts and spectres and stuff. And it reminds me a lot of the kind of elements we would see in later iterations of Swans, I would argue, where repeating bass and or guitar lines sort of create this structure, this skeletal structure, before instruments come in with these much more droning passages. I feel like on this track it's on a much smaller scale, of course, but I find it interesting nonetheless that this is something we will definitely see more of in Swans in the future. And of course, it just results in such a fascinating atmosphere that the whole track presents, right? And so track 6, Like a Drug, Sha La La La. This is another one of those loved and adored tracks by fans of Swans, I believe, especially from this album. It has all those quintessential qualities of Swans: heavy, angular guitars, slow crawling drums, this incredibly expansive vocal performance in Youre that just elongates his vocals in these incredibly low-end drones, essentially. Weirdly enough, musically, this track kind of reminds me a bit of Money Is Flesh, where you just have these unusual stabs of brass instruments intersecting the song rather uncomfortably. And to be fair, I know I gave it a lot of flack on the Money Is Flesh track, but on both versions of the track on both albums. But on Like a Drug, though, I don't think I minded as much, to be fair. I think it works much more in establishing this really uncomfortable nature of the particular track. However, what does kind of grate on me for some reason, and I'm not sure why, is just the sha la 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 part in the vocals, in the chorus, and maybe it's a controversial opinion of mine. Considering that the instrumentals get so much more angular and nasty at that part, I just don't like how that vocal sounds for some reason. It's just, I don't find it to be all that interesting, and for some reason I don't rate this song as much as others from this album, which is very weird and completely outrageous, of course, but the whole ethos of Weird Music is to just express my personal experiences of music itself, and we all like different things, and it's okay to dislike something as well, I would say. Not everyone has the same opinion. Regardless of what I think, though, there's still some great elements to this song, I feel, the religious aspect of this, of the album, which, especially with the whole album, one could interpret this song, as, I would kind of interpret it as a devotion to God, who's, one who is devoted to God. Their fervent devotion is perhaps akin to a drug addiction of some form, some kinds, where that sort of weirdness, it's very weird, but that's at least how I kind of interpret it when hearing this one, and it's interesting. It's not a bad song at all, don't get me wrong, it's very interesting. But moving swiftly along, we come to the 7th track, and I think we're perhaps passing over the halfway threshold with Children of God, with the next track of You're Not Real, Girl. And this is another interesting one, similar to Our Love Lies, in that it is mostly pushed along by this acoustic guitar. I quite enjoy the incredibly miserable, janky chorus that the acoustic is playing here, of which the strumming pattern dominates so much of the song, as Youre, of course, croons those wonderful low registers again, expressing a rather dark, depressing track that could perhaps be interpreted as, a physical relationship between two people, with him feeling that when they do become physical, is when she turns into this unreal person who no longer exists in this place and time. And I think the sheer concept, there's something really dark and depressing and, oddly scary about it, as well, with this, there being a recognition that there's this emptiness in her, but it's resulting in something very hollow and empty, And in consideration, I think it's a track that's very uncomfortable and downright creepy, but perhaps that's purely my speculation coming from the track, though. But it creates a very uncomfortable atmosphere, but that's perhaps why it's kind of fascinating at the same time, right? So, come on to track 8, of course, then. Beautiful Chart. So perhaps we're getting through all the creepy, uncomfortable tracks in one swift movie, because this one's a rather brutal and kind of uncomfortable offering from Swan, which opens up with this really confusing miasma of percussive elements, before you suddenly get this whirlwind of instruments, rushing back and forth at this absurd pace, before it just suddenly transforms into that quintessential Swans dirge, of course. And the structure of this one is so peculiar, offsetting Youre's really loud vocal performance, with these rather over-the-top backing vocals and intense backing instrumentals. And at the forefront, though, is Youre's tirade of a parent sacrificing their child, of course, with the repeated refrain of, "I could kill the child, the beautiful child." There's something so scary and terrifying about Youre's vocal performance on this one, which I would say it perfectly expresses the insurmountable fear that the lyrics present. And so many people interpret this track as sort of being an interpretation of the Abraham and Isaac story from the Bible, which has also been pretty much confirmed by Youre himself. The story being that God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac to him, and Abraham is pretty down with the concept apparently. And of course, Youre's presentation of the story fuses it with much more terrifying concepts, with him saying himself, the son being offered by the father, and mixed with the idea of this person who is going to molest or kill this child. And so as a result, this comes across as one of the most intimidating experiences on the album, and it becomes incredibly chilling from the lyrical content to those instrumentals themselves, which just continually punish and push along so pervasively. I would say as well, this is another track worth remembering, as we're going to come back into it a bit later as well. Moving along though, we get what I can only describe as a palate cleanser at this point, and it's another beautiful piano-led ballad by Jarbo, of course, and that is the lovely Blackmail. And so we actually mentioned this track previously in our video on Holy Money, as an earlier version of Blackmail appeared on the single release of A Screw. This reworked version, though, comes across as a much gentler, somber version of the previous iteration, which felt much heavier on those descents and the very notes of the piano. This one, though, as well as having that piano, it even has this lovely moment of ambience to open up the track before Jarbo just takes it away on the lead vocals there. Just beautifully singing the rather charming and lovely lyrics, And of course, whilst on paper the lyrics appear very pleasant and beautiful for Swans, it still feels like something is afoot, especially in consideration to the track's title and the second verse, which perhaps has the song expressing notions of manipulation within a relationship, I would say. As a result, then, it continues that darkness that so much of this album is presenting, though, whilst giving us a little bit of room to breathe after the heavy intimidation of the previous tracks, I would say. And following on from, we get track 10, Trust Me, which after all we've heard is very unlike Mr. Youre. This one, though, is another acoustic track which features a really lovely oboe performance from one Lindsay Cooper. And it creates this rather ominous little opener before it all just descends into those common conventions of Swans, slow tempo, fuzzy electrics, deep undulating vocal performances, And lyrically, very peculiar as well, of course, It mostly consists of this character perhaps convincing another that they can trust them, and it's not unusual to do so, but there's this one iteration where perhaps the truth is being said, where we hear, "You cannot trust me now." One of those Freudian slip kind of things, maybe? And as a result, it shrouds the whole song in this uncomfortable darkness, where it makes it feel like the character is attempting to manipulate the other, of course. And I should mention as well, though, this track has a very interesting ending of little field wheel recording with the sound of a rowboat upon the water accompanied by birds. And apparently for this version of the album that I've got, this has been shortened a bit, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is, of course, isn't it? But anyway, it's a really interesting track nonetheless, and maybe not one that actually stands out all that much on Children of God, but that's fine, right? There's a lot of tracks on this album. Some of them are bound to, come across like that, I would say. And so we move on to the next track of Real Love, which is another crooning Youre track pushed by this finger-picked acoustic guitar and some very interesting glides across the electric guitar as well. And this one has a very slow-paced, smouldering atmosphere, punctuated so much by that vocal performance, with Youre just crooning this sort of unusual little track, which is a little hard to interpret, but not impossible to do so, right? And frankly, when it comes to interpretations, I'll mention it here, all I can really go on is the moods and feelings I'm getting from hearing it and reading it, if that makes sense. And to me, especially within the context of this album, I'm given this kind of a sense of a story about Jesus, if that makes sense, wishing to be brought to the cold earth with real love, and spread the word of love kind of thing, maybe anyway. I could be completely wrong, but it's just a sentiment I get. But in any case, though, I would actually say that this is a track that I don't really rate all that much on Children of God, And with the album being over an hour in length, it is kind of oddly demanding, of course. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is nothing compared to what we will see Swans do in much later albums. But, this is probably a good point to mention this here. I feel like at times Children of God kind of suffers from a bit of a bloated track listing. Kind of like a lot of Modest Mouse albums, where if one or two tracks were just cut out from the entire thing, the whole album would flow so much more comfortably. Now, it's fair to disagree with it because, everyone has their opinions, of course, but it's just the sense I get from listening to Children of God that, especially with it being, actually structured songs, if that makes sense, it kind of just, plays out a little bit too long maybe, but it's weird because I do feel like Children of God is definitely one of Swan's best albums in their whole discography, but it's not one where I want to hear each and every song when I go and sit down to listen to it, unlike some of the later stuff, if that makes sense, which is really weird. I don't get it, but, this is why we're talking about all the Swans albums, sort of discover what I think about them essentially and work it out. Let's just move on though, kind of going off on a bit of a tangent there. We come to the penultimate track, Blind Love, which is incidentally the longest track on Children of God. And so remember that, by the way, when we come to cover Feel Good Now, the live album, in the next Swans episode, by the way. Anyway, this one opens up with a really menacing drum beat, though, with a lot of kind of muted instruments playing stuttered abstract sounds, whilst Youre, of course, does that wonderful low undulating croon that he does so well. And the more it all progresses, though, the more we hear this electric guitar just intermittently squeal with this discordant fuzz and feedback, but only momentarily, though. And it creates this really unusual soundscape that feels like it's just becoming so much more sinister the more it progresses along. And I have to say, I really like the kind of abstract guitar playing that we're hearing here, To me, it kind of comes across as a bit of a precursor to the kind of soundscapes you'll be hearing in the much later years of Swans, though, especially when they all just build and build and build and build with their guitar playing, just all the instruments, essentially. But anyway, of course, the song just builds and builds, and when we get to the refrain of Blind Love, it all seems to just fade away until we get this loud, tumultuous, discordant, fuzzy riff that sounds so intense, especially in context of this album, And especially, in the second iteration of this refrain, there's this really uncomfortable screaming and shouting from a multitude of voices happening in all different channels in your hearing. And I find it so interesting. It's taken a rather long while to get to this point in the album. And what's been awaiting us is this really menacing and sinister performance. And so lyrically as well, this one expresses the thoughts, at least to me, it expresses thoughts of an unborn deceased man of sorts, maybe even an unborn child perhaps, expressing their need to be loved irrespective of their current situation. And it comes across as a very dark and harrowing track, and I find it really interesting as well that it sort of follows on from the previous track, even being named so similarly to it as well. It's like you have two halves, with Real Love and Blind Love, with one being a gentle, somber track and the other being a really scary track. And I find that thematic ordering rather interesting, despite my reservations about Real Love as a track, though. And maybe that's been done on purpose, though, having the two songs sequenced next to each other like that. And in a weird way, it kind of makes Real Love work in context, therefore making all my points about it kind of moot. But this is the kind of stuff you discover when you talk about song by song. You go and sit down, write about it, and you go, well, actually, I've now realised this, if that makes sense. And so yeah, it's interesting within the structuring of the album, I would argue. In any case, though, we move on to the final track, the title track of Children of God, which is perhaps a favourite of mine from the whole album, I would say. You have this really interesting slow rhythmic drum beat and a bass that's stuttering on a single note, while Westberg does that customary fuzzy guitar tones, of course, right? And it all just pushes the song as Jarbo just so brilliantly sings the refrain of being a child of God. And it's a very repetitive track, truth be told, but I think it works well in the track's strength, as it kind of leaves the whole album on this sort of religious frenzy, though, everyone just up and rejoicing and celebrating the fact, And that works well with the, in terms of the whole concept of the album and the track's strength. It works very well with the core themes and concept that the whole thing's presenting. And as well, it's a really lovely vocal performance here from Jarbo, and I like that it adds this really lovely level of finality to the album. It closes it off just as strongly as it all opened, essentially. And so with that, we've essentially covered the entirety of Children of God by Swans. This is definitely turning into a long one for the Swans episode, but it's fine. Lots to talk about here. I can see why this one's a favourite among fans of Swans, though. It's because it's got a combination of all those, all the many elements of a strong Swans album, being incredibly dark, foreboding listening experience that flows from track to track. But as well, it offers us a very diverse track listing, that showcases so much more than the No Way era, of course. And it's easy to see this as a transition period between that monolithic heavy period to the sort of gothic rock era we're going to start seeing in the later stuff. Anyway, sort of away from the bubbling brutality and towards conventional song structures, maybe. In any case, though, it's a wonderful album, no doubt, and it's one that perhaps secretly showcases a lot of the kinds of core concepts we're going to see in the later albums, whilst also being this fascinating, dark, quasi-religious gothic dirge, of course. And so, within these Swans videos, I do often like to talk about the various release versions of the albums in question. And so, interestingly, there's actually been two different reissues of Children of God. The first being the 1997 compiled version that compiled Children of God alongside the World of Skin compilation, which, from my understanding, is a compilation of all the recordings, minus cover songs, of the side project World of Skin, which was also just called Skin at times. In any case, this was an interesting project that was perhaps the genesis for the more melodic output from the band, as the project essentially just featured Swans members Youre, Jarbo, Westberg and Crosby. And it's a project I've not yet dived into, truth be told, but I find it really interesting that in '97, Youre felt it was relevant to package it alongside Children of God, perhaps showcasing a bridging of the various gaps between the sonic assault of the early works with the new territory that Children of God was bringing. And so, I will say here, I'm unsure of whether we're going to be going into all of the side projects from Swans, but I feel like there might be a couple of relevant ones worth diving into, especially given at this point in time, the latest album, Swans the Beggar, kind of ties together a lot of gaps from these seemingly disparate releases. And so it might be worth actually diving into all these various side projects, but man, it's just only going to extend the whole mini Swan series, but we will see, of course, we will see. Anyway, though, just to go back to Children of God, as well as the 97 reissue, we also have the version that I currently own, which is the 2020 reissue that compiles the album with the live album Feel Good Now, which we will, of course, be diving into in the next Swans video, of course. And so this version of Feel Good Now, it differs a little bit from the original version of the album, mostly by reordering a bunch of the different tracks. But I'll say here, considering how exciting Public Castration was to dive into, I'm really excited to learn more about the whole live band. And, you know, with there being so many iterations and versions of the live output, I'm interested in seeing how one of the most beloved albums translates to the live setting. But we will discover that in the video on Feel Good Now. And so there is one more thing I want to discuss in this video before we close off. There's a possibility this might be one of the longest episodes we have on Swans until we get to the trilogy stuff, I would argue, or even soundtracks for the blind, but we will see. But when it comes to Youre, though, his lyrics, themes, concept, the ideas he explores through his words, we all, more often than not, get these incredibly dark and macabre looks at the world. And we've seen it before in various albums, these really uncomfortable and brutal themes. And Children of God is one that definitely does not shy away from such uncomfortable brutality at times. And so I think it's perhaps worth discussing what Children of God is most likely in reference to. And I would say proceed with caution, as this gets into some really dark themes, that we're going to be discussing, some really nasty things that happened. So it might be worth skipping ahead because it could be triggering, I would say. But still, definitely worth talking about, I would say. But yeah. So the Children of God refers to an actual religious cult that went through various name changes since their inception in 1968. And the COG was the first movement between the years of 1968 to 77, started by one David Brandt Berg. And the movement then changed their name to Family of Love in 78, then The Family in 82, and finally The Family International in 95. And so the cult apparently was comprised of mostly born-again hippies, convinced of some sort of imminent natural disaster that was going to happen to them, spurred on by Berg here, yada yada, of course. And it seems that the cult's main teachings were of salvation, apocalypticism, spiritual revolution, and happiness, and of course, distrust of the outside world. Typical cult stuff, right? The horror, though, comes from the rampant and systematic physical and or sexual abuse of children within the cult, though. And this came mostly in the form of love bombing, known as flirty fishing, which was a way in which mostly female cult members were encouraged to show God's love with sexual relations with potential converts. And so in a close-knitted cult with a distrust of the outside world, this turned into rampant abuse within the cult, going as far as abuse with minors, apparently. And of course it goes on and on and on, and there's some much more in-depth video essays going into the history of the cult, but I thought it was worth just mentioning it briefly here, as it definitely ties into a lot of the themes being presented on the album Children of God. And so, with Youre's interest in the dark, macabre, and genuinely uncomfortably disgusting parts of the world, it's no surprise that the entire story of this cult piqued his curiosity. And thus, it became embedded within the themes of the many songs, and even the album being named after the very cult itself, And I think as well, it gives a lot of context to some of the songs that we've been listening to in this album, In particular, one of the album's darkest tracks, Beautiful Child, and especially described as by Youre himself, it now makes a lot more sense within the context of this album, though, as well as tracks like Sex God Sex, which kind of blurs that line between sexual relationships and religious fervor, I'd say. Especially within context and expression of the cult's teachings, is that the concept of showing God's love through sexual relationships. It makes it all so incredibly uncomfortable and dark, but sadly, that's how history is sometimes. People do incredibly evil things. And, it's it makes the the religious fanaticism that's being presented on this album, it makes it kind of sound hollow and empty at times. I would feel like it rejoices and stuff, but it's not rejoicing in a beautiful way, but rather within this dark cult-like sentiment of doing incredibly dark, wicked things in the name of God, purely just to get away with it all. And it's disgusting, of course, but Swans have never been a band to shy away from such themes, and it really ties together so many of the themes on this album, especially what's being presented, which it makes it really fascinating. But I think as a result, it's maybe one of the darkest albums that Swans have written, at so far, I would say. And so to summarise, I can see why this particular album is highly regarded amongst fans of the band. It is, without a doubt, a wonderful album that branches off from the dirty sonic assault of their earlier works, showcasing the band's strength towards actual song structures, if you can call them that, for the most part, as well as expanding upon the instrumental palettes. And yet it all still incorporates so much of what makes Swans an interesting band. Their assaults through the music, their dark and harrowing themes that really get under your skin and make you uncomfortable. And definitely as a result, one of the strongest Swans albums, one that is highly regarded for the right reasons, I would say. Surely it's only going to get better and better from here on out, though, right? And so with that, I think we're going to come to the end of our episode of Weird Music. Another dive into the wonderful sonic world of Swans, of course. And what I find interesting about this particular review is that I found it quite daunting to begin approaching it, approaching the writing, as it was such a fan favourite, and I really wanted to do it justice. But I found, weirdly enough, as soon as I started writing about it, everything just came out so easily, and that was, I'm really glad of that, because I really thought I was going to struggle writing about this one. Of course, it is just some person's opinion on music, but maybe that's what you viewers are enjoying about this particular mini-series within Weird Music, just hearing somebody's opinion on the albums that you like, right? Regardless though, I'm actually genuinely enjoying diving into each of the Swans albums and learning just a little bit more about one of my favourite bands out there. No, it's definitely going to be a long slog getting through each and every album, I'll be honest, I have no idea how the more recent albums are going to turn out in their videos, or even when they're going to come out, but we will get there eventually. And so yeah, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. In our next episode of Swans, we will of course be covering the live album Feel Good Now. And after that, it can only be followed up, by a truly fascinating Swan studio album, right? Surely it's got to be a good one after Children of God, right? But yeah, with that, I wish you all the best. Take care and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.